welcome everyone. We are really excited to have a stellar group of panelists this evening to share their experiences of Earth Law in Canada, and particularly for this evening, what we are calling Voices of Champions, restoring our connection to water. So with that, I wanted to start by highlighting a little bit of what we do at Earth Law Center. So this is our wonderful team of folks that are working every day tirelessly to protect the planet and to be Earth defenders, as we like to sometimes call ourselves. I am Dr. Kelsey Leonard. I'm the Director of Water Advocacy for Earth Law Center. I've been with the organization for almost a year now, and am really excited about the work that we do for advancing Earth jurisprudence, Earth law, rights of nature globally. I just wanted to highlight all the people that make a lot of this work possible on a day-to-day basis. And more so to also sort of now narrow into some of the work that each of those individuals and their teams do in the context of Canada. But with that, I really want to now turn to introducing our panelists, the voices of the champions we're so eager to hear this evening. First up, I'd like to introduce Ian Moore. Ian is a law reform-oriented lawyer with a passion for helping redesign and decolonize legal and governance structures to align with the needs of both communities and nature. Next up, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Nejma Bolarbi, who is a North African Canadian ethnobotanist and socio-ecological consultant committed to supporting the integration and collaborative design of multidisciplinary frameworks in collaboration with Indigenous and local knowledge systems in both social, industrial, academic, and policy sectors. And then next up, I have Jenny Vega Gardenas, who is the president of the International Observatory on the Rights of Nature, expert member of the UN Harmony with Nature chapter, and special rapporteur in the research project conducted by the Max Planck Institute on Rights of Nature, Globalization, and Legal Pluralism. She has also been involved in the recognition of rights and personhood to the Magpie River, the first in Canada's history. And last but not least, we have George Brown, who is a lawyer, urbanist, and certified coach. He is principal of Integral North and president and CEO of Mooney's Bay Ventures Incorporated. Prior to this, George spent 9 years as president of the Ottawa Community Loan Fund, as well as 9 years as a city and regional councillor in Ottawa. As a councillor, he served as chair of the city's Economic Affairs Committee and the region's Environmental Services Committee. So as you can see, our panelists have a wealth of experience and information to share with us this evening, and I'm looking forward to diving right in. I really want to transition us to talk about what are some of the emerging Earth Law initiatives and opportunities in Canada that are inspiring you, getting you excited. I think maybe we'll start with you, Ian, and then just kind of work our way back around across the panelists.
Well, I would say there is a growing, at least in the world that I inhabit, there's a growing recognition that there is a need for change. There's a need for new frameworks. A lot of the thinking that would be characterized as Earth Law, I think, is at the same time falling under the similar umbrella of the revitalization of Indigenous legal orders. And I think it's important to not conflate the two. I think there's a history of that within the environmental movement. But the thing that's really providing me with a lot of inspiration is the fact that there are so many Indigenous nations and Indigenous communities that are really revitalizing, Indigenous legal orders that have governed those nations or communities for centuries, if not longer. And in many ways, I think that there is a stewardship that is reflected within those sorts of legal orders. In one way, I don't know if this connection is going to be very clear, but one area of my practice is working with First Nations communities on reasserting legislative jurisdiction around child and family welfare. Not the most direct connection to Earth Law or the rights of nature, but one of the conversations that often happens when speaking about child and family welfare is that the starting point is often land. And so there's this recognition, I think, within Indigenous communities that's spilling out to non-Indigenous communities, that ultimately there's a need to recognize a relationship to land, to water, to other species other than humans. And I find that quite inspiring. I do think that there are some really interesting seeds being planted at the legislative level with the recognition of UNDRIP, both in BC and at the federal level. I think that's going to create some interesting possibilities around changes to legal frameworks that we're working with. I do also think that the grassroots organizations that I'm working with are also really reflecting on what approaches they're taking towards the different environmental crises that we're facing. And I think there is a general recognition that what we've been using for the last however many decades just isn't really working. And so I do see a lot of groups just trying to think of new ways to approach things.
That was wonderful. And I really, much of what you shared there really resonated in the sense that what we may be sort of seeing or witnessing is Earth law being an opportunity or a conduit or a catalyst for different legal traditions and orders to come into conversation with one another where they previously really weren't, or there might be other obstacles in other spaces. Neshma, what are you excited about in terms of emerging Earth law initiatives in Canada?
My goodness. I think if I was to say what I was most excited about is probably the possibility of general education on better engagement with our ecosystems, because I think that, we're our structures and systems are based on the absence of that, actually, of that relational engagement with ecosystems. And that has created a lot of the structures that were, trying to mitigate a lot of the damage and harm that they're causing. And so that's definitely for me the most exciting part, is that we can try to get to a place where we can better understand our place within these ecosystems, and the diversity of knowledge, and the diverse ways of knowing and understanding. And of course there is an equity aspect in this, in addressing colonial frameworks, through the rights of nature, again, which are, from my understanding, very much based on many, are emergent from Indigenous communities, actually. And so that's definitely one of the biggest things, is this sort of hope that we can try to better understand our place within these ecosystems and have better relations with our other relations. I feel like, I think, of course, the work of the Magpie River, that Yenny, supported very much in ALC, through the Innu community, I was so huge. And of course, I think the first time I heard about the rights of nature being implemented in this manner was through the Waganui River in New Zealand, and had many conversations with Indigenous communities here about it, for many years, actually, I guess since 2017, I suppose, or even earlier. Um, and of course, the all these, even the the Chilcotin Nation with the Sturgeon River. I think really I'm just excited that we can collectively support already present pathways, essentially, and yeah, and this collaborative work that everybody's doing, and really, like, this understanding that this is yeah, like a collective, it needs a collective support, essentially, to be able to drive this with, and collaborative design, and not assuming anything, right, essentially, of communities or even our own understanding, because we are so it's sort of intrinsically have, our pathways are so deeply entrenched in these social structures that are clearly becoming very problematic, but have been for sort of since their inception, essentially. So yes, that's what I'm excited about, is to sort of change the paradigm, and that we can do that collectively. Yeah.
I love that. I heard you sort of say collaborative design, that Earth Law is really about collaborative design. I think that's such a key principle. And I think even more, something else that you said that really stood out there is Earth Law is also about amplification of already present pathways. So recognizing that this isn't necessarily some new invention of law, but that we are amplifying existing pathways that may be due to colonization, as you sort of started off saying, or other sort of repressive means have been decentralized from our consciousness. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm sure that Jenny has a lot of thoughts on this as well. And I'll turn it over to you, Jenny, in terms of what inspires you and excites you about Earth Law in Canada.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, absolutely. The Magpie River work was very, very inspiring for us, because, and I'm sure the real champions are the Innu community of Equanichit. And let me name just some names like Wapkun, Shanice, Rita, Mr. Pietasho, the chief, but also the people from the Mangani region county who take that step to embrace the movement. People like Mr. Noel, the prefet, Mrs. Sarah, Matthew, and Pierre-Olivier Boudreau from SNAP Quebec, who also take the step, a big, huge step to protect that river, to give the river a legal standing. For me, they are the real champions of this first declaration in Canada. And we had the chance to work with people who love the river, who love nature and take care of Earth. And I have to highlight also that not all communities are the same. We met people who kept traditional knowledge alive, who take care of land, forest, and rivers. And also we met people that are open to work in collaboration without regarding the origins of people with whom we collaborate. So we are grateful to those communities who gave us the chance to participate at this first recognition of rights of river in Canada. And we hope that we're going to be more and more.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for sharing that. And I think what I want to amplify from what you just said there as well is the way in which much of this work, particularly for Magpie River, was youth-led, women-led, really amplifying voices that traditionally in the water world haven't been present or haven't been equally recognized. And so I think there's these voices of champions that we're really excited to highlight tonight. So with that, I'll turn it over to George, and let's hear about what excites or inspires you right now in terms of Earth Law in Canada.
Well, all of the above, everything that's been said. I think, first of all, it is the youth. Our particular project on the KGCB, the Ottawa, we have two pro bono law students from the University of Victoria Law School, two law students from the University of Ottawa. On the Magpie, I see that there was pro bono law students, Pro Bono Students Canada involved. So that excites me. When Meredith and I first put our heads together on this as to, how are we going to start this conversation? We started with, we're going to have to document, because the watershed, as we know, is huge. We're going to have to document all these towns, and we're going to have to reach out to all these environmental groups and all that, start the conversation. And of course, then we both looked at each other and said, no, that's not where we have to start the conversation. There are 11 Algonquin and Shinnebec nations in the watershed. Meredith had done a massive amount of work before she left. She was riverkeeper for like 15 years on co-governance. And she said, no, we both sort of said, no, we have to start there. And so it's the whole business of, not knowing, bearing witness, taking action. That's a Zen peacekeeper order. But so we backed up and said, no, we have got to start with reaching out to our contacts in the various nations in the watershed. And that's what excites me the most about this. And I think Ian touched on it, and all of you touched on it, was this is going to drive, in my view, a much more legal pluralism in this country. So, I have to be honest, because I'm not an indigenous law expert. I'm not an environmental law expert, but it never dawned on me until a couple of years ago, only 1 or 2 years ago, that there were indigenous legal systems that weren't what we call Aboriginal law or whatever you study in law school, about how do you go through the Canadian courts to get what you want. That's not what we're talking about here. And as you've all said, this is about systems that have been in place for thousands of years of relating to the river. And of course, that was driven into our heads pretty quickly too. If you're going to talk about the rivers and indigenous views of it, you're not talking about rights. You're talking about relationships and responsibilities. Inspired Sturgeon River Law, the NIBI, the Water Declaration of the Treaty 3 Chiefs National Assembly, the Magpie River. This is being indigenous led, and that's the way it should be. And I'm just going to throw an iron in the fire and say, Earth law is important because as a settler, I've come to believe in many of the things that we're hearing from indigenous nations that they have said for thousands of years. And we're finally opening our ears, So it all is important. But for me, the most exciting thing is this is going to continue to drive true reconciliation in this country, hopefully. And as, for example, the Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia being given the right to co-manage, or not being given, to be acknowledged that they have the right to, to be involved in co-managing their own fishery. That's actually a huge, huge step forward. And that inspires me. So that's a bit of a ramble, but
not a ramble at all, George. You had so many really fantastic points. But that leads us into our next question, which is, we talked about what inspires us, what we are excited about in the context of Canada, but we're in a settler colonial state, so we know that there are challenges. There are challenges around the world for Earth law and for the movement. And so I'm curious where you think we sit in terms of what are some of the greatest challenges to advancement of Earth law and recognition of the rights of water, rivers, et cetera, in Canada.
I think that recognition that we are still within a settler colonial context is a good starting point for what are the challenges facing Earth law in general. I think that the way that legal orders are structured from the Canadian state level, they are fairly reluctant to acknowledge new ideas, fairly reluctant to reform themselves to anything beyond kind of gradual incremental change. And so something like recognizing the rights of a river, for instance, is something that's quite outside of the norm for the way that state law seems to work within the Canadian context. I think that there is also a risk of Earth law or the principles of Earth law being co-opted by environmental groups in much the same way that environmental conservation has in the past to leverage indigenous legal orders, and the kind of window of opportunity we have now where reconciliation is the word of the day for many people and for many governments at the provincial and federal level, and for that to be for the point to essentially be missed, that by and large reconciliation from a legal standpoint in many ways should be indigenous led, that indigenous legal orders should be honored and respected, and that the revitalization process should be one where settlers listen more than they direct. And so to the extent that earth law is being kind of pushed upon an indigenous community in the name of responding to climate change or to a biodiversity crisis or to whatever crisis or issue a certain ecosystem is facing, I think that could be a problem. And then I think another thing is in my practice where rights of nature is coming up is often it's a political response to issues facing communities, that it's not necessarily being looked at as a way to rethink our relationship with different beings and the natural world. It's a way to respond to pressing issues. So I have one client, for instance, where they are they've been detrimentally affected by a significant amount of hydroelectric development, and the various entities involved in that hydroelectric development generally have disregarded their interests, and it's been going on for decades. And so conversations around the rights of nature are in many ways being framed as, okay, is this a way that we can change that conversation or that we can change the situation? It's not necessarily a proactive, okay, like how do we actually just make things better? It's like, okay, how do we solve this problem? And I think in many ways that could cause the power of the concept of earth law to be watered down, or the concept of rights of nature to be watered down. I'll stop there, I think.
Yeah, thank you
yeah.
so much, Ian. I actually think that's a really strong point to hit home as a challenge, and what you mentioned there at the end, that if we're only wielding sort of earth law initiatives or rights of nature initiatives in opposition to pressing crises, it can stifle the opportunity for innovation in this space of law. So I think you touched on something that's really deep and that we need to explore further. And we may not be able to dive fully into it this evening, but we hope that others will heed that caution. Neshma, how about for you? What do you think are some of the challenges or a challenge that you're concerned with in the context of Canada and earth law?
Yeah, I mean, I I don't mean to constantly sort of go into the macro issue, right, or the elephant in the room, I suppose, which is the structures and systems that are built around societies, essentially our society. I think that is the biggest barrier. Governments have these structures and systems they have to uphold for social well-being to some, right? Not to everyone, clearly, right? And there's all of these trade agreements, and there's all of these structures that are placed that are already very well established, right? And essentially, I think that is the biggest barrier, because if when you look at, even just for an example, when you look at industry having legal personhood, for example, which is something that has been happening for centuries. So this is not a new attribution or anything like that. It's been happening since, I think, 800 BC, actually, right, to an extent. And so that's kind of where it started. And when you're talking about giving legal personhood to an ecosystem or river, which I think was really one of the main points of the rights of nature at one point, is to leverage, at least definitely for the projects that we're doing, that was the point, is that it was to leverage industries over extraction. I mean, and it's really quite colossal, right? In some of the areas that we're working in, billions of gallons per second, right? And so in a sense, I think that the way that we look at it is that these structures essentially don't even allow industry to have a way to stop, because they can just keep going, right? There is no limit. There's, especially, not all industries. I know that farming has had more issues and they've had to stop using water and so on and so forth. But I think that when we're talking about some of the barriers to, federal governments or local governments, it is these structures. And so I think that one of the solutions that we've been working on is finding innovative solutions, essentially, where industry would be supported, right, essentially in shifting their practices into sustainable practices. So we're trying to find these different pathways where it's not this panic button where it's like, oh my gosh, if like the river gets legal personhood, then we can't do anything. And it's just going to be, everything's going to be tied up in litigation and all these issues are going to happen and we can't continue doing what we need to do. And so this is why I think the paradigm shift is so important in the education aspect of this, in finding innovative solutions and this collaborative design, because each one of us and each sector holds a piece of the information of where the barriers are, in fact, right? And so that's sort of how I feel about it. And I think that there's an amazing opportunity to implement these concepts, but it is still based on this fear, I think, of if we go out of this structure that we're already that is already so well established, that there's going to be so many issues with communities and industry and all these different sectors, and a lot of resistance, and people are going to lose their jobs, and all the fears that sort of come up socially. And I think that that's the biggest part of this, is really to try to support these conversations with the federal government, because it is inevitable, and the equity aspect in this country is necessary. It's going to keep coming up regardless, right? So whether you address it now or not, it is still something that is the truth, right? Just as it is in Truth and Reconciliation, truth is the first word. And so it just makes sense to at least open the dialogue.
Thank you so much for sharing those insights, Nejma. And I think you also touched on something that I want to amplify around fear. And there can be a lot of fear in things that seem new or different. But Jenny, that didn't stop you and the work that you did. You helped with Magpie River, and now you're on to the St. Lawrence. So what do you think are some of the challenges, and how are you maybe addressing a little bit of what Nejma mentioned in terms of the fear and the resistance and the apprehension that I'm sure came along with the initiatives you've helped to spearhead?
Thank you so much for this excellent question. In my opinion, an important challenge in this time is to find consensus between different actors. And we have many free riders who are taking advantage of the status quo. And that allows some actors to pollute without compensation, without restorations, and they profit, they enjoy of that status quo. You want to stay there, we can do nothing, but we can change things. We can just try to do it. And I think also, when we were working before the federal election on June and July, we were trying to introduce the rights of nature in a federal bill. So we will have an important step because it will cover all Canada. And it will be an excellent tool for many people who are working on this paradigm shift. So then, like the example in Ecuador, going to be a fight before the courts, but at least maybe some groups could take the voice of nature. And I think it would be very, very important. And another huge challenge, I think, is the energy transition. Because sometimes we think that green energy is coming from water, wind, and sun. But people do not realize that the reduction of the consumption of energy is the best transition ever. So we consume less will be better than just taking the problem in another place. Because for green energy, we need to go to seek for rare earth. And when we are doing mining, going to affect lakes, rivers, and so we're going to take another impact in the ecosystems. So we should think better what we are doing and what the change we want to provoke is just to take to move the problems of oil production to mining, or we want to be aware and take care of the consumption of the energy we are doing. So we don't need all the time to use, for example, cooling, or because in Canada we have just 1 week that is very warm or very difficult, but it's just 1 week. We could just enjoy and less energy for that. I met a professor who took all the time the steps. He said, why use the elevator? It's just energy that you don't need to use. And some buildings, they leave the lights up the whole night. Why we are doing this? And this is an important energy transition. It's just the consumption. And so we could take more care of our ecosystem and the nature. It's so beautiful to be outside and to enjoy a nice river and to come back to a river and to have nice memories. I think we shouldn't be afraid of protecting nature. We shouldn't be afraid of polluting, destroying nature. I think we have to change this mind and go ahead and be courageous.
Well, thank you, Jenny, for all of that wonderful insight. I often say to folks too that renewable energy isn't energy justice per se, right? Just because it's renewable doesn't mean that it's a just pathway forward. We actually have to work for that. And you really highlighted that in the context of, another sort of question I like to pose to folks is justice for who? Humans alone? No, when we think about the water itself, when you think about the way in which extractive industry is connected to renewables, like you mentioned, with rare minerals, we have to, it's more than just a transition to renewables. It has to be more, and thinking about the way in which we change our behavior as humans in our consumption portfolio as well. So thank you for highlighting that for us, and in addition to everything else you mentioned. So last but not least, George, let's take it over to you for what you think are some of the challenges.
To me, the major challenge is achieving real, honest. It's about jurisdiction. I mean, if people, to say that you have jurisdiction over your territory, but you don't have jurisdiction over the minerals underneath. That belongs to the province, and the extent of it is, well, we have to not collaborate, but communicate with you. We need your consent, but that's not real jurisdiction. Real jurisdiction is what we're seeing beginning, with the Mi'kmaq and the management of the fishery, where they can actually make real decisions themselves based on their long history of living with on the water with fishing, etc. And look at the fear. Look at the riots, the burning down of stuff, that the stuff you still read in the news about these. They're going to destroy the fishery, etc. We are far, far apart still. I don't want to sound like Debbie Downer or whatever, from real authentic reconciliation, i.e. jurisdiction in this country. And to me, that is the challenge, and we have to continue that. But I mean, we're seeing it happen. We're seeing in nations talking about their relationships and their to the river and to nature. And we're seeing them. When I look at the I don't even know if this is the Sturgeon River Law document, where they put it down in writing, not only their values and how they relate, but how they're going to move forward, how they're going to deal with people that want to come into their territory and deal with the river. And they've recognized that we've got to put this in writing. We've got to put this down. It's been oral for thousands of years, but we want to put it down in writing. and we're going to enforce it. And that to me is a very positive thing. So it's not earth law. But I don't think we can have earth law in this country anyways, until we first have reconciliation, as we really said. Not the, an orange shirt is important, very important, but we have got to, if I listen to one more land acknowledgement, I understand, I feel it's important, but I was just looking at one for United Way. I'm the chair of United Way East Ontario, and it's really nice. Man, it doesn't come close to dealing with the hard issues of what does that actually mean, that you respect you're on our territory. We haven't taken that conversation to the next level, and that to me is going to be a major challenge. But it's something that is happening bit by bit, and earth law in its own way is going to just contribute to the conversation.
Thank you so much, George, for that. I think you hit on some really great points in the national context of Canada for those that may be less familiar in terms of reconciliation and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the report that came out in 2015. Others may hopefully are aware of the unmarked graves of children that have been consistently uncovered in the past year, have been known about for decades, if not longer, were documented in the TRC report, but now we're going through ground surveys, and so these unmarked graves are being sort of documented scientifically. And so we are in this immense state of national grief and trauma, and trying to understand how to process what reconciliation means, I think, to what George was just saying, to process also what types of action is required to actually meet the principles of the Truth and Reconciliation report, which has 98 calls to action. So it's not just about a performative of acknowledgement, but that we act. And I think that there is a space in which earth law and reconciliation meet or overlap or come into symbiosis. And that's a charge that we all have as practitioners and folks in this space to be thinking about, what that means and how do we communicate that to the broader public. And so that leads to, I think, a question that I'll round out our panel with, to what George just said about reconciliation, to what we need in terms of action and not just sort of performative statements. What is the role of the federal government in responding to earth law, responding to the needs of water, the rights of rivers? I'd love to call on Jenny to share a little bit more of your insight into this. And I know you mentioned the federal bill that you had put forward.
Yes, I think the federal government plays an important role in advancing earth law, but also with provincial governments, municipalities, First Nation councils, and First Nation traditional structures, judges, and citizens. So everyone should play an important role in advancing earth law in Canada. And as you know, law in Canada may come from different sources. So our constitutional model is based on division of power. So, and also the federal government explores the creation of a Canadian water agency. We think that in that structure, we could take the opportunity to include an expert role to this agency to support the work for future stewards of rivers, or also to see that agency as having a stewardship role itself. So we are convinced that federal government should embrace the movement of the rights of nature and introduce in the role of this water agency the possibility to act, whether as a counselor or as one of the guardians of water itself. As you know, we are campaigning for the St. Lawrence River personhood and rights, and we are involving every kind of governments. So federal, provincial, indigenous, and municipalities also, and citizens. So it's a collective movement, a collective work.
Thank you so much. And just to restate a little bit of what Jenny shared, the right now the Canadian government, federal government, is exploring the establishment of a Canadian water agency, sort of a federal agency. One of its kind has never really existed before in terms of articulating a national policy towards water by the Canadian state. And so it's also a prime opportunity to maybe inject rights of nature, earth law into more mainstream legal mechanisms across Canada. So thank you for sharing your insights into that. Do others have thoughts on what role the federal government should play in advancing earth law in Canada?
You know, one agreement with the Mi'kmaq is nice. You know, we could probably have 100 of these agreements across the country if the government was serious about it. So, I mean, co-governance, Meredith Brown, and I have to fall back to Meredith, who she worked for years on a co-governance on the Ottawa River issue. And there was absolutely, I'm quoting her, zero interest from the provincial and federal governments. And I go back to a Barrier Lake and the Algonquins of Barrier Lake. And if you've, you know, that's well documented, their struggles. But, you know, at one point they developed a tripartite agreement that was like, and this was like, I don't know, it was 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And it was radical because it actually involved tripartite, you know, responsibility and governance in their territory. And the feds, so they got it to a point and the feds walked away, Quebec government walked away. And then the minute they started complaining, you know, third-party management came. So the government is either serious about this, about jurisdiction, about governance, about, you know, or they're not. And if they're not, then we'll get the struggle will continue. But if they are, you know, I have to give them some credit. People were shocked actually when they did do that in Nova Scotia. So I'm hoping that they're going to continue to do that. And I hope that Indigenous nations continue to demand it, you know, and put that on the bargaining table as something that is a non-negotiable, you know. So we'll see.
Well, thank you for sharing that, George. And I think you've raised some additional really strong points, and to others, feel free to continue to answer the question around sort of the role of the federal government in advancing earth law. But I'd love to transition to some of the questions we've gotten from the audience. And the first one is, and I think it's related to where we are right now in our conversation. So what is the ultimate goal and how do you suggest we achieve it? The rivers and river dependent communities I know want humans to stop and or reduce water diversions, water pollution, and dams. So in this work, what are our ultimate goals as a collective or in your individual capacities? What do you see as the main goals of this work?
I mean, I want to go back to sort of what Jenny was saying, that this is a collective endeavor. It really does take community, municipal government, federal government, you know, and I think at least my personal goal, which I've already sort of stated, which is fundamentally changing our perspective and understanding to be on par with ecological systems, which we're part of, I think would really make a big difference in how we operate continuously, right? And how we build, you know, and shift our structures and so on and so forth. And again, of course, it is an opportunity in practicing equity in practice, right? Essentially with communities and asserting sovereignty from nation to nation as well in these types of conversations, and the support I think from the general community is really needed. And I think that, just to go back to the federal government question, if the general population is educated on this, right, which is it's really infallible, right? Essentially, I've yet to find some, you know, an argument against it, you know, as beings on this planet and on this earth, and these, you know, with who need water and air and so on and so forth. I think that I've heard often that it really does take the general population's sort of education and paradigm shift in order to be able to shift the structures of federal governments as well. Certainly not everywhere, but I think that Canada is a great candidate for that, for sure.
Thank you, Nejma. I think there's a question that has been sitting with us in the queue for a little while, so we'll take that one first. And it really is a question around, I think maybe the big one that we all kind of get as practitioners in the space of who gets to speak for the river. So who acts in essence as its spokesperson or guardian ad litem? It's difficult to find information on this particular question or issue. Associatedly with some jurisdictions, it's, that may recognize the river's legal personality, while others do not. So when there's contestation or conflict, who gets to speak for the river, and how do we decide, and how do we enforce? So what are folks' thoughts on what sometimes is termed guardianship? George, you even mentioned it earlier, kind of ombudsman. We have different terminology as lawyers, I think. But anyone that has thoughts on who gets to speak for the river, or how you've conceptualized a process by which to make that determination.
So I think this is a very important question. And you can find different models that have been adopted in different countries. So for example, in Ecuador, everyone is like a guardian. So everyone can take an action to protect nature. And we are promoting a new model inspired more in the New Zealand, but with some guardians that are the representative of the collective. So we have, for example, the representation from government, representation from indigenous peoples, from the communities, also from NGOs, so forth. So you can see a different structure we propose in order to see that we could propose different models to represent the people who take care of water. But the important thing is that the guardian should be have the main, the sole interest to protect the river, not his own interest, because he cannot take the interest of the municipality, of the interest of the agriculture or the industry, or the interest of even a nation. Have to think in the interest of the river. But in fact, the best interest and the best for the river is the best for us. And that is what we need to understand. We protect nature, we protect species, we are gaining our right to water, our right to a healthy environment is fulfilled. So we need guardians that can be can put apart the selfishness that we have as humans, and that's the more important to become a guardian, I think.
I just want, yes, I think that exactly what Jenny is saying is that there's various models depending on where you are. But at least in my experience, there are already guardians and of the river who understand it very thoroughly and understand sort of how the ecosystems function within the river. So they're already present, and many of them are, committees of elders and then spokespeople that sort of, that share this information and so on and so forth. So a lot of it is already there. And then I think that in for the Waikiki River model, that's the model that they've used to an extent with by majority as the spokespeople, because there's all of this knowledge about the river and ecosystem and how it functions with reciprocity and so on and so forth. And then there has been other folks coming in from municipalities and government that also have this interest that Jenny's talking about for the river. But by majority, I think the model that, that we've seen is already kind of there. So it's just kind of supporting the already present model, in that sense.
Well, I think we have time for one more audience question, and then we're going to turn it back to the panelists to wrap up our evening. They've been so generous with their time. So our last audience question comes from Tony Zell.
It wasn't so much a question. I wanted to answer. Simone posted a question in the chat box as an artist about participating with Earth Law as part of our movement. And I could not be more enthusiastically encouraging. Absolutely, yes. Art is a lead indicator of social change. Law is a trailing indicator most of the time of social change. So we welcome the support of artists, and yeah, you can connect with me at the Earth Law Center. I'm up on the website somewhere, and I'd be happy to speak with you.
Thank you so much, Tony, for sharing that, and to everyone for tuning in this evening and sharing your insights. I think what, a big takeaway from what all of the panelists have shared as well is this is, I think you said it, Nejma, earlier, collaborative design. And so we need folks from all different backgrounds and with different skill sets or gifts, as we like to say, coming together to do this work, not just lawyers. Maybe some might even say lawyers got us into this mess to begin with. So we are open to all folks being a part of this work and this conversation. And then I also just want to highlight Michael from IEN, Indigenous Environmental Network, talking about some of the complexity of the Whanganui River case. And, earlier Ian noted this as well, that there have been ways in which there are challenges to Indigenous sovereignty. George, you mentioned this earlier, to challenges to Indigenous jurisdiction, that sometimes Earth law, rights of nature language can be co-opted to be sort of weaponized against Indigenous sovereignty, against, and you mentioned this earlier, to folks who want to learn more. Arthur Manuel's Reconciliation Manifesto book is a wonderful text to read, to learn more about how the semantics, the language that we use, we have to make sure we're speaking the same words. And although we might right now in this evening be speaking English, sometimes we can get lost in translation. Sometimes the words of the colonizer, I think even as Manuel might have referred to it, can be wielded against others or sort of used outside of their intended meaning by Indigenous peoples. And so just acknowledging that there may be some Whanganui folks who aren't as happy with the way that the law has shifted and shaped the legal context of that part of the world. But I think what Nejma pointed earlier, we have seen in just 5 years' time a shift, a global shift in conversation, where we are now bringing together voices across Canada to be talking about legal personality, Earth law, rights of future generations, criminalization of ecocide, all of the different aspects that you've talked about this evening, things around rights for the Ottawa River, rights for the St. Lawrence, rights for the Magpie. I had, a wonderful mentor, Nokomis Josephine Mandemanbaugh, who passed away, sort of known as the original water walker. She didn't like that term, but folks know her as someone who walked all of the Great Lakes in ceremony and prayer. And she was a real big advocate for recognizing that inherent spirit of the Great Lakes and of water. And so I think just in these recent years, seeing how much this vision has grown, and in recognition of Indigenous sovereignty and solidarity and liberation, I think there's just so much more we can do from here with great allies and also Indigenous-led initiatives and projects. So with that, in the time that we have left, I want to turn it back to our panelists to share a little bit about what's next in your work and how can the attendees support you as we transition away from our conversation this evening. I think to start, maybe we'll go with George.
Well, I know on our project, we have the students doing a lot of research, sort of on case studies, a lot of the things we've talked about. But our aim is to host a community conversation, most likely in mid-March. Meredith and I are beginning our outreach to the 11 nations in the watershed. Yeah, that's probably the one part of all those nice questions you gave us that I didn't really think about. Other than if you are in the Ottawa River watershed or interested in the Ottawa, please contact me because we'll put you on a mailing list and keep you in the loop as we start the conversation and the listening.
That sounds wonderful. Thank you, George. And we will be sure to put folks in contact with you. Next up, let's go to Jenny.
Yeah, thank you. We are, as you know, we are building an alliance from the province of Quebec to protect the St. Lawrence River. So if some of you are actors that would be happy to join the alliance, you're welcome to contact us. I will write in the chat our email. And also, if you want to sign the petition, we have started a petition to ask governments to change the law and to adopt a personhood advice for the St. Lawrence. It's not easy to do, but we are in a conversation. We hope we have some chance to try to change everything, the status quo. So we are working very hard on that. I put in the chat the link of the petition. Also, if you want to make a donation to the International Observatory of the Rights of Nature, or if you want to get involved in our work, for example, an artist that said that he could be happy to participate in some of our work. And something to conclude, thanks to all of you who are protecting the source of life. It's very important to try to do something to change the status quo, and that is no longer acceptable. And lawyers can be protectors of the establishment, or we can be engineering of social change. So I'm going to invite you to take that way instead of the first one. Thank you so much. It was very pleasant to exchange with you, and I'm so sorry for my English because I don't use it in Montreal. I use more French and Spanish. I'm happy to share with you our experience. Have a nice evening.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful closing remarks. Next up, Nejma.
Yes, we are. I think one of the biggest things, like I was talking before, is this, education aspect of rights of nature and relational engagement. And so we're building an educational campaign that is hopefully very transferable because of different sectors that we're working in globally. But, one of the things, just to go back to the art aspect that was mentioned earlier, is that we are wanting to do this through as many possible mediums as possible. I think one of the things that we thought about was guerrilla theater and just really engaging folks. So part of the educational campaign is, of course, panels and conversations and bringing in all the different sectors and being part of this movement. I know it sounds very idealistic, but we're starting with the concept of fundamental value. And so there's a lot of this work is actually about healing. So it's about healing ourselves from these structures that have been harmful to us and our ancestors, to all of us and our ancestors, and also healing our relationships with our ecosystems and our other relations. And so that's one of the big things that we're doing, and we would absolutely love to collaboratively design this with everyone that's participated here and beyond, because again, each one of us holds one piece, right, of the puzzle. So
thank you so much. And we will be sure to make sure that everyone has your contact information and links to Terra Ethics and the work that you do. So last but not least, Ian, we'll turn it over to you for our closing comments.
Thanks so much, Kelsey. Well, I think in terms of next steps and moving forward, I think one thing, and maybe this is circling back to the federal government question even, I think that for those of you who are in Canada holding the federal government and the provincial governments and the municipal governments accountable, pushing for a paradigm shift in how they approach questions of our relationship with beings other than humans. I think that in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, there's conversation around a just transition. And I think that there is a risk of that being, I think the federal government even uses the language of a human-centered just transition. And obviously that's not really reflective of what we're discussing tonight. And so, you know, there are really key windows of opportunity, policy windows of opportunity to hold a government accountable around right now. I think another thing is a big part of our conversation tonight was around the relationship between reconciliation, revitalization of Indigenous legal orders and Earth law principles. And by and large, there's a fairly large amount on the shoulders of Indigenous peoples right now and in Indigenous governments. And I know every single community that I work with, they're stretched so thin by everything that they're dealing with right now. And so to the extent that you can donate in ways that support Indigenous nations, Indigenous governments, if you're in the lower mainland of Canada, there's the Reciprocity Trust, which is a new-ish initiative to essentially pay a portion of your mortgage or rent towards the Indigenous territory or the Indigenous nation whose territory you inhabit upon. That's one way. And then there's also a lot of granting organizations. So just supporting financially Indigenous communities to do what they can, because they, at least in my experience, are quite stretched. And so if groups are also going to want to have these conversations around Earth law with settler groups are wanting to have these conversations, then I think they should also come with some financial support as well. I think that's a really good thing. So donate if you can.
Well, thank you so much, Ian, and thank you to all of our panelists. I think, yeah, that's a good note to end on, that a lot of this work also takes money. And so each of the folks here this evening have donated, obviously, their time and their blood, sweat, and tears probably to advancing this work across the globe and within Canada. But there are so many more folks on the ground who are putting their bodies on the line, or putting their heart and souls into this practice, in addition to their sort of physical entities. And resources like financial capacity, if that's what you're able to contribute, are so needed and beneficial. So on behalf of Earth Law Center, we want to thank all of our panelists for this wonderful conversation this evening, just kind of touching the surface on entering a conversation around what Earth law in Canada currently looks like, can look like, and should look like in the future. We thank you all sincerely. We thank all of our attendees this evening for joining us. And if you want to learn more about Earth Law Center, please visit us at www.earthlawcenter.org. And you can donate, you can volunteer, and you will be able to find the recording of this evening's webinar there as well, along with contact information and ways to follow up on some of the action items that our panelists shared with you this evening. Because to what each of them said earlier, this is not just an exploratory conversation and theoretical law. This is actually about action and mobilizing for that collaborative design and amplification of already present pathways. So thank you to all. Have a good rest of your day, evening, time, in whatever part of the world you are in. And we hope to join you in conversation again soon. Take care.